Good afternoon. Welcome to the CARES-ESSER Grant Application Overview Webinar. My name is Erin Given, and I work within the Division of K-12 Systems and Supports at OSSE, and I'm going to be your CARES-ESSER Grant Manager. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. First, it would be helpful, can somebody in the audience give me maybe a thumbs up in the chat if to confirm that you guys can hear me? Okay, it looks like I think we're good. As you come into the webinar, you're going to automatically be placed on mute to cut down on the background noise. And since everyone's on mute, in the control panel, you'll see a question box. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can type them into the question box and I'll stop periodically to answer questions as we go. At the end of the presentation, we'll also have some time for questions, a question and answer session. I also want to let you know that the webinar will be recorded and we'll post it to the OSSE Cares website after the presentation along with the slide deck. The handouts includes a copy of the slide deck and another reference document that we'll discuss as we go. So the purpose of this webinar is to review the CARES-ESSER grant and specifically how to apply in OSSE's Enterprise Grant Management System, or EGMS. We're going to go over the grant background, eligibility, allowable uses, grant timeline, and the EGMS application. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, was signed into law on March 27, 2020. It provides funding to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus or COVID-19 public health emergency. And within the CARES Act is the Educational Stabilization Fund, which includes several programs to support schools in their response to COVID-19. One major program within the Educational Stabilization Fund is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER. You'll hear this referred to by us as CARES-ESSER, and this is the program that we're discussing today. So CARES-ESSER is a formula grant to LEAs that's based on the proportion of your Title I Part A funds that LEAs received in the most recent fiscal year. So in this case, school year 1920. Final allocations must include adjustments for new and significantly expanding public charter schools, and these adjustments will be released later in the summer and may impact all LEAs. But per guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, we already accounted for the new and significantly expanding public charter schools in our preliminary allocations. So we think any adjustment, we're anticipating any adjustment would be an increase only and will be in the range of maybe 1% to 2% compared to your preliminary allocations. Although ESSER funds are distributed by the Title I formula, they are not Title I funds. ESSER is its own separate flexible program and it's intended to support schools' COVID-19 response. So certain Title I requirements like supplement and supplant do not apply to ESSER funds. So now we're going to discuss some allowable uses. CARES-ESSER allowable uses are broad to address the impacts that COVID-19 pandemic has had and continues to have on your LEA. Allowable uses include costs prompted by COVID-19. So for example, sanitation supplies, PPE, increased technology infrastructure, learning management systems, and it also includes allowable activities under existing federal programs, including ESEA, IDEA, McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Act, Carl D. Perkins Act, and the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. Information regarding CARES-ESSER allowable uses can be accessed on the OSSE Cares website, which is linked here, and I've also posted an allowable uses guide to the webinar attachment. So this is what's included in the allowable uses guide, and it's a highlight of allowable uses within the CARES Act and also across the federal grant programs. And then the guide also includes a one-pager for each federal program, giving a little bit more detail on the allowable uses within those programs that might be relevant. We also understand that your needs in response to COVID-19 might be really unique. So please reach out with any questions to the OSSI CARES email if you have any questions on allowability. The period of availability for CARES-ESSER funds is March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2022. This means that your LEA will be able to request reimbursements for allowable costs incurred back to the date that the President declared a national emergency, which is March 13th, 2020. But LEAs have flexibility in how the funds are distributed across the fiscal years, FY20, FY21, and FY22. For federal and local auditing purposes, we're required to break out the grant application by fiscal year, and the application that we're discussing today is specifically FY20, which runs March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2020. The EGMS default allocation for your FY20 application is 30% of your LEA's total preliminary allocation, but CARES-ESSER is a flexible program, so LEAs can request an amount other than this 30% default. For example, your LEA may not need any money before September 30th or not have any planned expenditures. So you can request 0% for FY20 and then spend everything in FY21 and FY22. Alternatively, you may plan to spend the entire allocation this year, so prior to September 30th, 2020, and then you can request 100% of your allocation be loaded. And then any amount that is not budgeted in FY20 will be available in your FY21 application and FY22 application. And then any unspent budgeted funds in FY20 and EGMS will carry over into FY21 once EGMS closeout process is complete. So after your December closeout, any funds not spent that were a part of your current year application will carry over and you'll have them available. LEAs can request a different FY20 amount than the 30% by completing an LEA request form for CARES-ESSER allocation adjustments. And it's found on this link, and I'm going to go into more detail on the next slide, and on this link. And also, you may have seen it in the most recent LEA Look Forward, and we sent an email last Friday about this process as well. So the form is really simple. It just asks 4 short questions: your email address, your LEA name, your name and job title, and then what amount your LEA needs for the period between March 13th and September 30th. And just please note that when you fill out this form, it should be completed by either an LEA leader or a fiscal grant or grant staff member that's included in your EGMS application contact list, so that we can verify that we're good to move forward with adjusting the allocation. So included in the email we sent on Friday were some dates that the adjustments will be made. We're going to make them several times throughout the summer, including 3 dates in July. So if you request an allocation adjustment and we receive it by this Friday, June 26th, the following Friday, well, really Thursday, because next Friday is a holiday for the 4th of July, your allocations would be available in EGMS. And then there's an adjustment where if it's received by July 10th, it'll be available in EGMS by July 17th. If it's received by July 24th, it'll be available by July 31st. And then there's 2 other dates in August and September. Please note that when you complete your EGMS application, your budget must match your allocation in order to submit your application. And we'll discuss this in more detail later in the presentation. So now, before I move ahead, are there any questions on this? I'm not. Okay. How will allocations to LEAs who do not receive Title I funds be made? Do non-Title I schools receive this funding? No. So this, based on guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, to receive this fund, this funding, you must be a school year 1920 Title I-A recipient. The only exception to that is if you're a new charter school opening for school year 2021, and that was the adjustment I was referring to that's going to be made before the allocations are final. Any other questions before I move forward? I don't see any. Great. So now we're going to move into the EGMS application itself. All applications must be submitted through the EGMS, the Enterprise Grant Management System, EGMS. I think you're all very familiar with that, and it can be found at this link. As discussed, this EGMS application is for allowable cost plan for fiscal year 2020, so March 13th through September 30th, 2020. Applications will be reviewed and accepted on a rolling basis as they come in, and the deadline to apply is 3 p.m. on September 30th. But we encourage you to apply. If you intend to spend funds in FY20, we really encourage you to apply much earlier than September 30th, maybe by July 31st or so. Oh, and I see that another question came up. So the question is, so if we apply now for the 30%, could it be for a different purpose than the remaining 70%? Yes, as long as it's all allowable under the, CARES-ESSER allowable uses, then you get to decide and dictate how you want to spend it. So this grant is really designed to be flexible and meet your specific needs in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The EGMS application will contain the following sections or tabs. We'll discuss each of these in detail: the overview, award administration and assurances, contact information, funding distribution, detailed planned expenditures, submit, application print, and application history. But I really want to note that the bulk of the application is in the detailed planned expenditures, and there's no budget narrative required for this application. The first tab is the Overview tab. You should review this section for general information about the grant. I want to note that this tab lists allowable uses as written in the CARES Act, so it might be helpful for you to read through that as you plan your LEA's needs. Then the next tab of the application is Award Administration. Here you'll find the terms and conditions of your grant. And these two sections are just for information only. There's no fields that you need to complete. The Assurances tab. The next section, the Assurances tab, in this section, you'll be required to read through each assurance and check the box to indicate that your LEA has read, understood, and will comply with the assurances. I want to note that, that the first assurance requires a narrative description, which might be a little unusual. So it's not listed here, but I'll read it, and then if you guys have questions on it, we can answer it now or at the end. So the assurance that requires a narrative description is in 1 to 2 paragraphs describe how the LEA, when using CARES Act grant funds, will ensure that students, teachers, and other beneficiaries with special needs have equitable access to and participation in grant-funded activities. Potential barriers that can impede equal access and participation include barriers based on gender, race, color, national origin, disability, and age. Would it be helpful to give an example of what this assurance could look like? I guess you guys can just let me know. And so I see somebody asking about equitable services for DCPS. We're not going to be talking about equitable services in this webinar. Yeah, yes, I think the yes is giving it to, if we should give an example of what the narrative answer could look like. So here's an example. We will use CARES-ESSER funds to purchase computers and laptops as part of our school-wide technology upgrade. Because a significant portion of our students are from families where Spanish is the primary language spoken at home, we will provide user instructions for the computers in both Spanish and in English. Please also note that after the assurances have been submitted, the Assurance Agreement Summary tab will show the date when the program-specific assurances were submitted. Now on to the yeah, we can follow up separately on equitable services. So the next tab that you'll need to complete is the contact information tab, which if you've completed an EGMS application, it's pretty standard. You'll need to provide information for the LEA executive director or head of school, the primary program contact, and the additional contacts, so like the grant manager or a fiscal manager. And if these people are different from the person responsible for submitting the application, please make sure that the person responsible for submitting the application is included in an additional contact. You can add up to 5 additional contacts. This tab's important because the individual listed here will receive copies of the automated approval or disapproval notices for the application. So next is the funding distribution tab. Here you'll see your FY20 allocation. It'll start as the default 30% of your preliminary allocation, and then if you've requested an amount that's different, if you've requested your FY20 allocation to be adjusted, you'll see the revised amount here once it's ready and loaded. It's important that your planned detailed expenditures match the amount that's listed here before you submit your application, or the system won't let you submit it. If you have a reimbursement request that you need processed immediately, you can submit your application using the 30% default budget and then amend after the reimbursement request has been processed and your allocation is actually loaded in EGMS. And then I want to note that this is an informational section only. There's no requirements on this tab. And just give me a second to try to see the questions. Okay. So now we're to the detailed planned expenditure tab, which is really the bulk of your application. So here you're going to need to fill out your planned CARES spending for FY20, or the dates we've been saying, March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2020, for each of the 5 budget categories: salaries and benefits, professional services, equipment, supplies and materials, and fixed property costs. Each expenditure line requires a CARES budget code that details the type of expense and how it is in line with allowable uses of CARES funds. These codes also will help us facilitate required reporting at the state and the federal level. So here's what the CARES budget codes look like that you'll use in your application. There might be cases where more than one code's appropriate, and when that's the case, just use your judgment and please pick the most specific code possible. So an example could be for regression mitigation activities for students with disabilities. You could please mark it as SWD, which is here, even though this expense could also be coded as other. This list is linked at the top of each of the detailed planned expenditures tabs, and I'm going to show you an example of where it's linked on the next tab. So here at the top, this is your salaries and benefits tab, but on each tab, there's a link here that will take you to these codes. So here's what the itemized expenditures for salaries and benefits looks like. You'll have to fill out information for each planned expenditure. So for salaries and benefits, you'll include the name of the individual planned for the work, the position title. You'll select the appropriate budget code from the drop-down list, the percentage of their time on CARES-ESSER funding, and a description of the expenditure and total planned cost for the person. And then this is what the tab looks like for the other categories: professional services, equipment, supplies and materials, and fixed property costs. For these, you'll need to include the item to be purchased, the CARES-ESSER's budget code from the dropdown, a description of the expenditure, and the total planned cost. Your description should be detailed enough that it's clear that the work is linked to the allowable uses of the CARES-ESSER funds. It should include what goods or services will be delivered and to who they'll be delivered. And it should also include information explaining the cost basis for the item. For example, the number of units of a good. This section can be as many as 1,000 characters. And I'm going to give an example of what these entries could look like, but first I want to just double check the question section. And okay. So an example of an incomplete entry is this first. So if you said items to be purchased laptop, the budget code is DEV, and then to facilitate distance learning. Well, this is clearly an allowable use of the funds, and the budget code is correct. It's not really very specific, and it's hard to really understand what your planning is. So a more complete entry could look like the items to be purchased, you're purchasing 25 laptops, and the why, the when, and the who they're for. So our LEA purchased 25 laptop computers as part of our school-wide technology upgrade to facilitate distance learning. These computers were purchased in April 2020 and have been distributed to students without access to a computer or laptop. Any questions here before I go forward? Okay. And then finally, the last part of the detailed planned expenditures is the budget summary. This will provide a summary of costs by CARES budget codes and by budget category. It's automatically populated with information from the itemized expenditure tab. So there's no fields to complete on this tab, but please review to ensure that your expenses are placed in the correct categories. Now onto the Submit tab. So we're almost done. Submissions are due by 3 p.m. on September 30th, 2020. Please avoid technical issues by submitting early. We're recommending by July 31st or soon thereafter. On this tab, you'll run the consistency check, lock the application, and submit. And the submit button will not be available after 3 p.m. on September 30th. Then for the application print and application history tab, these tabs are just available if you need a hard copy of your application. Just note that the EGMS generates PDFs only once an hour. And then the application history tab can be available if you wanted to see all actions involving your application. So we understand you'll probably have questions as you work through your application. Please feel free to reach out to me directly at erin.given@dc.gov or to the OSSI CARES email address, which is ossi.cares@dc.gov. And then for technical questions, you can reach out to the EGMS help desk listed here. So now we'll open the floor to any questions, and I'm just going to need a minute. I'm kind of having trouble seeing the question section, so just give me 1 minute to figure that out. Okay, so I have, can we begin to enter information on the application before we let you know our allocation amount? I'm going to get back on that one. I think the answer is yes, but I just want to make sure that the information you enter will be saved even after revised. I actually think I can now unmute, and that might be easier for me to see the questions. Okay, so please stay muted unless you have a question, but also feel free to ask your questions. Okay.
Hi, I joined just a couple of minutes late. Can you say what you said at the very beginning about communicating the allocation amount? Thanks.
Yeah, so the allocations are based on your school year 19-20 Title 1A allocation. So it's a proportion of what you received compared to the overall Title 1A allocations. But we're also going to be making adjustments to account for new and significantly expanding charter schools as required by the U.S. Department of Education. So those adjustments will come out later this summer, and we have already accounted for them in our preliminary allocation. So we anticipate it might be like a 1 to 2% increase and not a decrease to the preliminary allocations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, did you also say something about letting you know what those allocations were? That's the part I was just confused about.
Okay, so so LEAs have flexibility. This grant runs from March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2022. And for our federal and local accounting purposes, we are required to separate the grant out by fiscal year. So our fiscal year ends September 30th. So this application is specifically for March 13th through September 30th, 2020. And we loaded EGMS with a default of an LEA's of 30% of an LEA's preliminary allocation. So if you want an amount different than that, you're going to have to let us know. And I'll go back to the slide. There's a form that you can fill out, and the form is linked here. And we also sent it out in the most recent LEA Look Forward that went out on Friday, and in an email to relevant program contacts at LEAs that received CARES funding. So you have the option to adjust your FY20 allocation to whatever amount you need. This is very flexible money, but you just need to let us know. So you'll complete this form just by giving your LEA name, contact information, and then the amount that you need. And we're going to make adjustments 3 times in July and a couple times in August and September as well. Does that answer the question now?
Yeah, so even if we're using a lower, I guess here's my question, even if we're using a lower, we still need to fill this form out. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, I guess I'll leave that up to the LEA. The catch is that if you fill out your budget at 30%, but you only need 10%, you're not going to be able to access your unspent funds until closeout has been complete in EGMS, which happens, in December or January. So it really depends, I think, on how much you think you anticipate needing at the beginning of FY21.
Gotcha.
Because we would, yeah. Cool.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so feel free again to reach out directly to me at erin.given. I'll go down to the contact, or to the OSSI CARES site with any questions that do come up. And I'll give you one more opportunity. If there's any questions, you can ask them now. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time.